That's not the one. To give some background to this project, I built a late 60s style full-size Dalek in 2015. This Dalek was built mostly from fiberglass and painted with car spray paints. Aside from my terrible handiwork, one of the things I was most disappointed about is how, even though it photographed well, it looked like a giant plastic toy in real life. When you see footage of the 60s Daleks on TV, they look like they are made from metal. Here is some footage from the evil of the Daleks. I've since discovered this effect is almost entirely due to the sensitive cameras and harsh studio lighting, rather than the paint job itself. The 60s props at the Doctor Who experience had the same problem. They look like giant toys despite having looked good on screen. I think the issue is that spray paint doesn't reflect light in the same way that raw metal does, so it is very difficult to get a convincing effect up close. On television, this can be countered by carefully controlling the lighting. I decided to rule out building the Dalek from steel, as it weighs a ton and frankly I hate working with the stuff. So that realistically only leaves aluminium as the principal material. There have been a few aluminium Dalek builds over the years. Here is a very impressive example from user Aaron Tammy on the Project Dalek forum. By the way, I should point out the Project Dalek forum is an amazingly supportive place with every bit of information you could possibly need for Dalek building, including PDF plans for all the major Dalek variants. The major stumbling block for a complete aluminium Dalek seems to be the dome. Now, I could cheat and build one of the black dome props from the evil of the Daleks or the Magician's Apprentice, but that would defeat the point. The dome is what is at head height and what best reflects light. I looked into having the dome spun, but none of the engineering companies I contacted were interested. I then wondered if it would be possible to cast the dome. YouTube videos exist that show casting similar sized pots and skillets with similar wall thicknesses. It was discovering the King of Random's Mini Metal Foundry videos that encouraged me that this project could be possible for a normal guy at home. During the process of editing this video, I was terribly saddened to have discovered that Grant Thompson from the King of Random has passed away. I just want to say you were a massive inspiration to me, and my condolences to your family, friends and colleagues. You will be sadly missed. To get started, I pretty much wholesale copied Grant Thompson's design for the Mini Metal Foundry. At the time, the only small bucket I could find was for kids' sandcastles, and this spoiled the finish when pulled out of the plaster. A crucible was cut from an old fire extinguisher. A hole was cut in the bucket and a nickel tube used to chop through the refractory. This tube was then taped to a hairdryer. Charcoal was added and the furnace fired up for the first time. The lid broke apart while melting the aluminium. Here I didn't realise quite how much dross was under the surface of the aluminium. Please God don't spill this everywhere. Oh, still a bit of crap on the top actually. might just be the aluminium cooling down. Right, let's give this a go. This will probably burst into flames though, because it's got a Teflon coating on, so here we go. So this is my first go.
In fact, this one's perfect. Does look cool, man.
God, I think so, isn't it? Bloody hell. Come on. So all of that, I think, is dross. Absolute. Look at the state of that crap from the cans.
Nice.
I think a load of dust and shit got in there. There might just be some aluminium that hasn't melted as well, so we'll keep that. We'll melt it at some point. They look terrible, but they are my first ever aluminium ingots. My second attempt at making ingots didn't go so smoothly. I made the mistake of putting too much charcoal in the furnace underneath the crucible. The temperature became way too hot and it burned through the crucible in a matter of minutes. Not wanting to waste the day, I made the dreadful decision to try and use a galvanised steel paint pot as a crucible, thinking that being outdoors it would be okay. Not only did that pot burn through as well, but I was exposed to zinc oxide fumes. I developed a touch of metal fume fever and ended up suffering a banging headache and the shakes for a couple of hours. Don't be this guy. I got another fire extinguisher and was able to melt the last of my can collection. I had a go at filming with my phone in my left hand and managed to miss every single can being melted. Ugh, idiot. This is the metal I extracted from around 200 cans. My ingot collection was progressing, but nowhere near enough to do any real casting. Using the Mark III plans from the Project Dalek website, I made a start building a late 1960s Dalek gun. When I built my previous Dalek, the rods on the gun were glued onto the tube of araldite. This didn't work well, as the rods kept popping out of the holes in the metal rings. This time round I decided to try brazing the rods onto the metal rings. The rods are made from 3.2mm aluminium welding rods. The main gun tube is 1-inch aluminium tube and the rings are cut from 28mm aluminium tube. The rods were bent around a piece of wood cut to length. Annoyingly, the rings had a smaller inner diameter than the 1-inch tube, so I had to use a Dremel to grind away their insides until they slid over the tube. The ends of the rods were filed down to make a shoulder, so they would pass through a 2.5mm hole in the ring and stop at the right depth. I then had a go at brazing the rods onto the rings using some Durafix brand brazing rods I got from Amazon. I didn't do a good job controlling the heat applied from the torch and ended up melting through a couple of the rods and one of the rings. I persevered with this cage, knowing it was now scrap, so I could get a bit more practice at the brazing technique. I made another set of rings and rods and tried a second time. This time I was more conservative about applying the heat and stopped at the point where the joints looked like they would hold and were not dry. I didn't try and get too nice a fillet on the joints in case I ruined it. I also made sure I sat the cage on a piece of ceramic from my fireplace so they didn't melt into my ESD mat again. The next day I took the brazed cage outside and used a Dremel to grind the protruding sections of rod away from the inside of the rings. The rings were then slid back onto the 1-inch tube. The cage had warped slightly due to the heat and had to be twisted to get back onto the tube. This worked well as a twist meant the cage was held onto the tube by friction. I did some filing of the brazed joints to tidy them somewhat. I also added a stainless steel ball to temporarily complete the look. I need to cast an aluminium sphere and finish polishing the gun before it is complete. I cast a fiberglass dome from my existing mould used on my previous Dalek. This will be the pattern for sandcasting the aluminium dome. Meanwhile, I rebuilt the plaster refractory in the furnace, this time using a large plant pot, and got to melting my growing pile of cans. There was a lot of dross left over which I cooled using water so it could be remelted later. After 5 melts, I still had not even amassed 2 kilograms of ingots. That evening, inside my house, I noticed a strange noise. I don't know exactly what was bubbling out of the dross, but I don't keep it anymore. I was starting to amass a reasonable collection, but it was clear I was not going to be able to cast any large parts with the setup that I had. I clearly needed a much bigger furnace to be able to cast the dome and neck rings. I was tempted to try building an electrical resistance furnace, such as those designed by YouTubers The Art of Weapons and the Veg Oil Guy. I have an electrical engineering background, so felt relatively comfortable with the designs, but I worried that I would not be able to heat the massive volume required from a UK 13 amp domestic supply. Also, they would not be cheap furnaces to make, and I am trying to build this Dalek on quite a tight budget. I found a blowtorch at a hardware store that was only £60, so this gave me a cheap entry into trying a propane furnace, as I already had bottled gas. For the furnace build, I ended up trying out the King of Random's Mega Foundry design, as it was cheap and I could make it in a few hours. Having used this furnace a few times now, there are a few issues with the design that I will go into in a later video. Instead of a bin or a trash can, I used a garden incinerator as it already had a hole in the top. It was galvanised, which shows I don't learn from my mistakes. To insulate the furnace, I got some 25mm thick ceramic fibre blanket or Kea wool from eBay. This entire roll only cost £52 including delivery. I initially cut the circles for the bottom of the furnace oversized, but there doesn't seem to be much give in the Kea wool. I ended up cutting it back to the line to get it to fit. I put 2 layers of Kea wool at the bottom. In retrospect, I would have been better lining the bottom with ceramic fire bricks to take the weight of the crucible. Two layers of Kea wool were added to the sides. Again I tried cutting the pieces oversize and ended up cutting back to the lines to make them fit. A single layer of K wool was used on the lid. I didn't see any point using more material as there is a bloody great hole in the middle. The K wool was attached to the lid with some M6 screws I had lying around. I didn't have any large washers to hand. I should have made the effort to find some, as the K wool has now perished and won't be held on by the screws and nuts. The three pieces of metal holding the K wool to the sides of the furnace were the feet for the garden incinerator to keep it off the ground. I didn't think being on the ground would be a problem because of the insulation, but having used the furnace a few times, now there are scorch marks on the grass in my garden. Furnace build done. Thanks for making it to the end of part 1. Sorry the footage is so variable. If you enjoyed the video, I have a lot more. If you enjoyed the video, I have a lot more coming up soon. I'm hoping to produce better content with every video. If you can find it in your heart to give me a like or subscribe, that'd be amazing. Take it easy guys, you're the best.